Okay, welcome everybody to this third debate that we have at the Georgina Mace Center. Before, I should say that Theresa May was supposed to be here. For months, she was very keen to be with us, but with the snap election and the timing, it wasn't possible anymore. So, and unfortunately, she's not here. But we've got fantastic people on the panel. And I just wanted to say, so it has been the third time, as I said, we do this biodiversity debate at the Georgina Mace Center. Georgina Mace Center is a multi-faculty center of the college, and is dedicated to Georgina Mace, who was a colleague working in here. I'm sure you'd all agree she was one of the most prominent ecologists and conservation biologists, but also an absolutely wonderful colleague and person. Sadly, she passed away 4 years ago, and her husband, Rod Evans, is here, and just wanted to say a few words before we start. So, over to you.
Well, thanks, Vincent. I lost my badge temporarily. I found it again, but that follows a pattern. I was giving the dad speech at my daughter's wedding, and my cummerbund suddenly went boing, and that got more laughs than all my prepared jokes. Well, thank you, Vincent, for this opportunity. Not knowing, of course, how many of you actually knew Georgina or were at the centre's opening event, I thought a quick intro and update might be helpful. As the centre's website illustrates, Georgina is perhaps best known for her work in developing the criteria for the inclusion of species in IUCN's red lists. And to offer encouragement to some of you young scientists out there, that work was largely carried out in addition to her day job when she had 3 young children, or maybe even either side of the last one, I can't remember exactly. And her lawyer husband was also working full-time, helping to run the legal aid system in London. That is when we had a properly functioning justice system and a legal aid scheme worthy of the name. I was hoping to make a joke there about what a great result that was last Sunday. But that doesn't quite work now, does it? Anyway, I digress, and I can see her now on the end of the front row, rolling her eyes and going, "Oh, get on with it." So, as my old cricketing opponent, Prof. Andy Purvis, said at the centre's opening event, Georgina's later work on biodiversity, ecosystems, and the concept of natural capital may yet prove to be even more important than what she called the red list stuff, if perhaps more difficult to define. That was reflected in the variety of the 30 or so speakers, national and international, at the discussion meeting held at the Royal Society in June last year, entitled Recovering Nature, Building on Georgina Mace's Work to Ensure a Biodiverse and Livable Future. For me, that was an extraordinary 2 days, and major thanks to Vincent, John Bridle, who I don't think is here today, I don't see him, and others for organising it. But as with the red list stuff, her later work was conducted collegiately and collaboratively. Glad I had a sip of water before trying to say that. Scientifically and academically, both here and with the setting up of the Centre for Biodiversity and Environment Research at UCL, of which she was the founding director, and where I've just heard that UCL are to rename a garden in her memory, though I won't make any comment about how long it might have taken UCL to do something, but there you go. Anyway, and politically, with her inputs to Dieter Helm's Natural Capital Committee and later the Climate Change Adaptation Committee, not to mention the Dasgupta Review, the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, etc., etc. Her approach on those things changed over the years from one of saying to the politicians, "Here's the science, now over to you," to a recognition that the scientists, and that's you, have to mix it with the politicians to have any chance of achieving beneficial outcomes. And I like to think our dinner table conversations may have had something to do with that. Georgina's achievements were recognised in her lifetime, of course, with several gongs from the state, honorary degrees and awards both in the UK and from institutions elsewhere, to name Japan, Germany, Holland and Spain, to name those that readily come to mind. But the one that meant most to her was the recognition by her peers in her election as a Fellow of the Royal Society. And I'm happy to tell you that the Society has now taken all her papers to be catalogued and stored in their archives, no doubt to be made available to interested parties in due course. And finally, in July last year, Professor Spencer Barrett wrote to me on behalf of the Royal Society. Let me read his email. Dear Mr. Evans, I wanted to let you know that we would like to publish annually in the journal Proceedings B of the Royal Society the Georgina Mace Review in Conservation Biology. We plan to invite prominent researchers in conservation biology and biodiversity science to write reviews on current topics in the field. Given Georgina's enormous contributions in this area, we think this would be a wonderful testimony to her scientific legacy and the enormous contributions she made in helping to preserve biodiversity. And he went on, this will be our second named review at Proceedings B, the other being the Charles Darwin Review in Evolutionary Biology, which has proven to be highly successful. We hope you approve of this initiative, which has the full support of the Royal Society. Oh, that's nice, I thought. And then the enormity of it began to sink in. And if anyone's entitled to view it through rose-tinted spectacles, it's surely me. She'd be seriously cross with me for saying this, even privately, let alone in public. But second only to Darwin, huh? I hope you'll forgive me the overstatement, but that, ladies and gentlemen, is why the place you've come to today is called the Georgina Mace Centre for the Living Planet. Thank you.
Yes, so following on from enormous work, we want to see this event today as a big brainstorming how we can get biodiversity much higher in the agenda of the politicians. I think it's very timely because we've got a new government. There was a letter signed by 200 scientists led by EJ that was sent to all the leaders of all the parties. We've also got a COP coming in November. So I think if we can see this debate as a way of discussing and then maybe get it to the government. We've got scientific advisor to the government here also, and then that would be a success. So to introduce the debate, we have our Vice President at Imperial College, Maggie Dahlman, who's going to say a few words. Maggie.
Good evening, everybody, and what a wonderful place to be on an evening like this evening out at Silwood Park. I haven't been out for a while, actually, and walking across the lawn reminded me of how wonderful this place is. A very warm welcome from me on behalf of Imperial College, both to our Imperial friends and colleagues, but also to people that have come big distances, actually, to be involved in the debate this evening. And of course, it's very appropriately being held in the Georgina Mace Centre for the Living Planet and Biodiversity. And the discussion this afternoon will focus on the challenges and opportunities around the future of biodiversity. But Vincent asked me to give you a little bit of background about Imperial College before saying a few words about some of the people that have made a difference in this scientific field. So we've recently published a new strategy called Science for Humanity. Quite ambitious, I think you'll agree, but we're ambitious as a university. It's got 3 overarching aims: enabling talent, powering research, and amplifying impact. Some of these words, But actually, underneath everything, underneath those words, there's so much determination to make things happen. And within those 3 overarching areas, there are 9 flagship projects. I won't bore you with all the detail on those. That could take a while. But I thought I would just highlight 3 or 4 of these that I feel quite passionately about and which I think are fantastic additions to our strategy. And the first one of these is Imperial Inspires. And this is all about engagement and outreach, which is a really important dimension now to what we as scientists do, to allow access to publics, many different publics, to the research and education that we do. And we work locally, nationally, and globally. And in fact, there's been some fantastic engagement activities out at Silwood Park. And the aim is to spark curiosity and nurture the world's most diverse STEM-B students, bringing more to the world of STEM-B and STEM-B to more of the world. Secondly, Imperial talent. Well, you know, people make Imperial what it is today. We wouldn't be here without the amazing staff and students that we're able to attract to the university. And our focus is, you know, attracting the best and nurturing them, supporting them, and developing their talents. Imperial Innovates, it's an interesting one. It's really a natural next step in our activity for Imperial College to make Imperial a global centre of gravity for scientific innovation and entrepreneurship. It'll fuel experimentation and enable Imperial's visionaries, that's you guys, many of you guys, to turn big ideas into trailblazing companies. And if any of you haven't been out to our new campus in White City, please come and visit. It's extraordinary what's going on there at such pace. And it's particularly exciting for me because it's in an area of town which is the sort of diametric opposite to South Kensington, which is full of leafy lanes and rich people. White City is not. White City is an area of huge deprivation. And this district, this re-establishment of a district and providing support through the university is really an exciting dimension, I think, of what we're doing. Imperial Futures, that's the last one I'll talk about, will enable breakthroughs by convergence and systems approaches, imagining and creating the kind of world that future global citizens need. Sustainable, resilient, healthy, and eventually, I hope, equitable. We are coming at this from a very strong foundation. I'm going to make some of our colleagues groan now when I announce again that we recently became ranked number 2 in the QS rankings, number 2 across the world. Not just in the UK, although that would have been amazing in its own right, not just in Europe, but in the whole world. And, you know, you can argue whether these kinds of rankings mean a lot or not much. But it is, I think, for a British university, a moment of real pride in what we are able to do. There's a plane going overhead, so you can't hear any more of the boasts that I'm going to have. But we are, you know, we're in the top 10 in most rankings, so I think all of you should be proud of being part of Imperial and friends of Imperial. So obviously this places us as increasingly well positioned to speak about the biodiversity challenges. And of course, we've had historically a fantastic impact on global challenges in the natural world. And the leaders of Silwood have really had a pivotal role. We've heard from Rod about Georgina. What I would add is to say she was a great woman, she was a great scientist, and she was a great friend. And we miss her, as I'm sure you do. So, others, just a couple of names to talk about. Sir John Beddington, who is Professor of Applied Population Biology and specialises in application of economics and biology to problems relating to management of fisheries and other renewable resources. He's acted as many of our colleagues have, as advisors to governments and other organisations. And Sir John Lawton, who led the Making Space for Nature report, a DEFRA review of England's wildlife sites and the connections between them, with recommendations to help achieve a healthy natural environment that will allow plants and animals to thrive. What's wrong with with that aspiration. I think it's important for me to say, but I think you will recognise that Imperial tackles these sorts of challenges from a multidisciplinary, convergent kind of way. And this is not all about Silwood Park, although a lot of really amazing stuff happens here, but the entire university being brought to bear on the problems and challenges that we face. And I think we are ideally placed to address such global challenges as we move forward and embrace collaborative new initiatives through our schools of convergent science. I'm looking forward to a very interesting discussion this evening. And again, welcome to Silwood and to this debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maggie. Just one point of correction. This isn't a lawn, it's a biodiverse pasture. And you can tell that it's a biodiverse pasture because it's covered in ragwort. And Nick Isaac will tell us how many pollinators depend on ragwort. Is it 180, Nick? That sounds about right. There you go. From CEH. I mean, you heard it from the gurus there. Right, so I am the co-director of the Institute. Georgina threw me a lifeline at a critical point in my ECR career, so I am forever indebted to Georgina. And I've spent my career working on links between biodiversity and public health under that umbrella that we call One Health these days. Anyway, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speakers today. We've got Dame E.J. Milner-Gulland, Professor Richard Bargett, Dr. Mike Barrett, and Professor Gideon Henderson here today as our four speakers, just to stimulate our mental activity and before engaging in some discussion around the topic today. So, first up, we have Professor Dame E.J. Milner-Gulland, and we know her as E.J. She's the Tassos Leventis Professor of Biodiversity in the Department of Biology at the University of Oxford and Director of the Interdisciplinary Centre for Conservation Science. E.J. is an expert on understanding and influencing human behaviour to reduce biodiversity loss and on enabling businesses to improve their environmental and social sustainability and on controlling the illegal wildlife trade. So E.J. is particularly known for her work on ecology and the conservation of Saiga antelope. And with Natalie Petrarelli at the IOZ, she recently wrote a very impactful letter, didn't you? So please, E.J., come to the stage.
It's slightly daunting to be up here after these speakers. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for coming. And it's a real honour to talk about this. So I thought I would start us off by reflecting on the global biodiversity framework and some of the important elements that come from it, and particularly finishing off with how scientists could better engage with it. So that was something that was finally negotiated in December 2022, 2 years late, under the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's got a grand vision that I'm sure we can all agree with around humans living in harmony with nature. That's lovely. In 2030, we've got a more concrete mission, which is to halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And that's the thing that finally we as biodiversity scientists have something to aim towards and something concrete. And actually, a lot of this is thanks to Georgina. And this is the graph you're going to get bored of by the end of today. I like this one particularly because if you look very closely, the very last mammal standing on the business as usual scenario is a Saiga antelope. And that's nothing to do with me. So that's good. So yeah, you can see in this graph, this is a decline in biodiversity under the Living Planet Index to date, and then how it's going to go if nothing happens. And I'll just draw attention now first to the green line, which kind of reflects halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. And what that means is you can see that the decline stops, we reach our point of inflection and start to go up. And then it's not for some decades that we actually get back to the 2010 target. So given that saigars are so very prominently featured in this diagram, I thought I might start by saying halt and reverse biodiversity loss is something that could potentially be feasible if you think species by species for particular species that you care about. So here is the saiga antelope, and here's its decline as a result of the breakup of the Soviet Union. You can see it lost 95% of its population in a 10-year period, pretty unprecedented for mammals, went straight in at the top of the charts in terms of endangered species at critically endangered. So that was what happened in the late 90s, early 2000s. Here's us going up to date, which rather shows that what we thought was normal in the 1980s was in fact not normal at all. And here it keeps on going up. Don't ask me why. And now it's just been reclassified as least concern or near threatened. So that's the kind of species where you can see huge increases if you put 20-something years of effort, which we all did, into this. And of course, if you've got a relatively nature-depleted country like ours, then you can do reintroductions like this cute beaver and, potentially you're restoring biodiversity. On a smallish scale, you can do something like what NEP is doing, and you can rewild an area and start to get, more functional biodiversity on the broader scale. But I think as things stand, the halt and reverse biodiversity loss on a global scale is another thing entirely, and something which is much, much harder to achieve. So when we started coming towards the Global Biodiversity Framework negotiations, so around like 2019, 2020 and so on, all the big NGOs got behind this thing called 30 by 30. And you'll know about this, and I thought I'd talk about it because it's on your invitations as this is the answer. This is what the Nature Conservancy, the biggest conservation NGO in the world, said. We're committing to 30-30 because our future depends on protecting 30% of the planet, the biggest conservation commitment the world has ever seen. I would say that this is very much necessary but not sufficient. So 30 by 30, 30% of the world protected by 2030, sounds like a really nice tagline, which I think is why everybody went for it. But if you look at the detail of the target itself, and don't feel you need to read it, the point is the large amounts of text. The 30 by 30 thing at the top is fine, but that also includes ecologically representative, effectively conserved, well-connected, equitably governed, integrated into wider landscapes and respecting the rights of indigenous people. All of that also has to be fulfilled. Much harder. So here's a picture of the UK to give us an example of a country. And here in the UK, we've got about 8% of our terrestrial and freshwater landscape preserved at the moment, so quite a way off from 30 by 30. We've got 49% of our inland coastal waters, which was a big push in 2005. Lots of them were designated. And these are all different kinds of protection. So coverage, bit of a way to go, but quite easy to measure. Starting in down the list, and I'm not going to take you all the way down because that would take forever, but let's just think about effectively managed. And here are our sites of special scientific interest, which are the backbone of our nature estate. And I'm not picking on the UK particularly because Gideon's here or because it's the UK, but this is replicated the world over. This is not just the UK. But you can see that most protected areas are not in a favourable state as things stand, and that's something that the government is working towards as one of its targets. Going back out to the global level, before we had 30 by 30, we had 17 by 20, which didn't quite trip off the tongue so much. 17% of the world's protected areas, world's estate protected on land and 10% on sea. Now you can see that we actually met that target by 2020. That's the blue line. I can't really read without my glasses. No, the green line. We met the target. In the same period as we were working towards meeting that target, we lost 50% we had a 50% further decline in our living planet index, which is vertebrate by individual numbers of vertebrates, wild vertebrates. So clearly we were meeting targets while failing to actually meet the underlying thing that we actually wanted, which is halt and reverse biodiversity loss. And this complicated graph on the other side is just an example of how even if you manage things effectively, that doesn't mean that actually your protected areas are safe. So this is 6 different ways of self-reported management effectiveness for PAs around the world. And on the x-axis, and on the y-axis is percent of land conversion within protected areas, which is a measure of protected areas not working. And again, you see no correlation. So coming back to the glorious graph, now we're going to talk about the orange line in the middle, which is where we would be with the best guess of these modelers if we conserved properly. So 30 by 30 would be one example of conserving properly. We'll get to stasis. We're not going to get to halt and reverse. And that is because we're not tackling the underlying drivers of biodiversity loss. We're not tackling consumption, production, global financial flows. There is a target in our global diversity framework which addresses that. And again, loads of text. And it's the one around trying to get companies to disclose, report against and mitigate their impacts. It's a really important one, but it's been really very much downplayed compared to the protected area targets. But this is the one that might potentially, this and Target 19, which is about giving some money to the Global South, are the ones that might actually shift the curve. So Target 15, this one, companies are starting to do this, and in some countries, places like the EU, we're starting to get a bit of mandatory disclosure. This is one of the early examples of a company doing this, which is the University of Oxford. And you can see here, we're looking at the different types of area of operation. So our built environment is the top one, food. I can't really read without my glasses. I think it's food. Natural environment, resource use consumption, and travel. And basically what we see is the huge amount of biodiversity impact that we have as a university, and this has been replicated for lots of companies now, and I'm sure it's the same for Imperial. It's lab equipment, lab consumables, paper, those kinds of things. So things that we actually need to fulfill our mission, which makes it a bit awkward. Oxford thinks that it's got a really great environmental strategy, and I agree. So we want to get to bending the curve for biodiversity by 2035. Here we've got the left-hand side is our current strategy for getting there. The dark blue is the uncompensated impacts that we're going to have to do something about through biodiversity offsets or something. It's 67% of our biodiversity impact. The rest can be mitigated by reducing our IT, reducing our fleet, and so on. The middle bar, which I'm going to talk about briefly, is what would happen if we really, really went for it. And this is something that was absolutely impossible, not socialisable. So no alcohol, no meat, no dairy, no cars, no more buildings, halve your IT, halve your lab consumables, i.e. some really difficult decisions to be made about what kind of lab work you do and you don't. Not possible. So, as universities or as any other company, you can start trying to mitigate your direct impacts, but what we really need to be doing is pushing for systemic change. So we can do our private impact reduction as best we can, but we need to be working with our communities, with the sector, and with the government, and with broader society to try to change things. Now, there is a group called Nature Positive Universities, which is starting to try to do that. We've got 138 pledges at the moment, not Imperial yet. I'm hopeful. And the pledge is to just say what you're going to do, set yourself a target, start working towards that target, report every year how you're doing, and start to try to influence broadly. Okay, so that's the Global Biodiversity Framework. Overall, we have a framework for action now. It's pretty good. There's some good stuff in there. We don't have much time. 2030 is rushing up. But the key elements where we're not really focusing are these supply chains, global financial systems. We need to have more ambition. We need to have it urgently. So what is the role of science in all of this? And I think, obviously, there's some obvious stuff. We can speak truth. We can do independent analyses. We can, and I've just given some examples where this is really happening well, carbon biodiversity credits. We can do robust impact evaluations. We can do, especially people in our room, we can do metric designs. We can do monitoring of biodiversity. We can think about the methods. Importantly, we can test them because every second day you get a paper coming out with their next favourite metric. I've made a biodiversity metric to add to the pile. The number that have done any sensitivity analysis at all is like tiny. That's something we could do. We're obviously at the knowledge frontier of innovation. We obviously can do long-term studies. Silwood's a perfect example. We can also do demand-driven evidence provision that helps people making policy, making decisions with the things that they actually need to know. and we can build capacity for the next generation of scientists and decision makers. And this is something that a new UKRI-funded initiative is doing called Cascade, working with DEFRA, JNCC and CBD to try to think what kinds of evidence is needed and getting early career researchers to help provide that. And that is something that Imperial is part of. So that's good. So last slide, Georgina. She was the epitome of that kind of what science should be. You know, she always spoke the truth to power. She was clear, she was incisive, but she didn't hide the complexity, which I think is really important. She was also a pragmatist, someone who knew how to get things done in the best way, didn't stand on her high horse. She got dirty and got in and did stuff. And yeah, never reticent in getting stuck in. So we miss her terribly, and I hope that the kind of work that's now going on in this area is something that would have made her proud, because it's all based upon her foundations. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, EJ. That was a roller coaster of a talk. I took a dip in the middle when I started thinking about all my -80 freezers chuntering away. But then I remembered that Imperial's going beef-free by 2026. We're going to start eating antelope. So take from that what you want. Anyway, moving swiftly on. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Richard Bargett. Richard is the Professor of Ecology at the University of Manchester. His main research interest is the study of plant-soil interactions and their impact on nutrient cycling and plant community dynamics in natural and managed ecosystems. He's published over 240 scientific papers and is a highly cited researcher in ecology and environmental sciences. He's written several books, including The Biology of Soil in 2005, Above Ground, Below Ground Interactions, and his recent book, Earth Matters, How Soil Underpins Civilization. Richard is an editor of the Journal of Ecology, a member of the Board of Directors of Rothamsted and the Netherlands Institute of Ecology Scientific Advisory Board. He has been president of the British Ecological Society and was elected an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand in 2006 and a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, and is a member of the Academia Europaea. So, thank you very much, and Richard, may I invite you to the stage.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure. I came here, I was trying to think when I was walking around. I think the first time I came here was actually about 1994 or 95 when John Lawton was here. And I came here to work on the Ecotron. And ever since that time, it had quite a profound influence on my own career. And I carried on working here for many years, also working with Georgina, who was also a big influence on my career through her work, but also through working with her at the British Ecological Society. Well, what I'm going to do today is really sort of take a different tack entirely on biodiversity, in that what I really want to do is talk about an area of biodiversity that's, I would argue, is pretty much neglected in the majority of these treaties and targets. And that's what I've called the unseen majority, which is the diversity of life that lives within the soil. Now, I'll talk later about how soils are becoming more prominent within policy, and there are targets starting to emerge. But all the same, I would argue that they are still pretty much neglected from the majority of these treaties, and in terms of nature conservation as well. And I'm going to start by giving you sort of 3 reasons why I think soil biodiversity should be fully integrated into these treaties, and also there should be targets related to soil biodiversity and other soil properties to ensure the protection of soils in a changing world. And I think the first reason, which is a very clear reason, we heard before about there being many different pollinators associated with ragwort, but if you just took a handful of soil out there, there'd be tens of thousands of individual species within that single handful of soil. And there was a recent study by Mark Anthony that actually estimated that globally around 59% of all species on Earth, and this is probably an underestimate, are actually found within the soil. So arguably the soil is the most speciose habitat on Earth. But as I said before, it's pretty much been neglected, certainly in the past, in terms of treaties and targets related to biodiversity. So I think that's probably the most prominent reason, in that, quite simply, the majority of biodiversity that you see in the Earth is actually found within the soil. But I think the other reason is that when we talk about sustainability agenda, these organisms play a fundamental role. The interactions between different groups of organisms, the animals, the microbes and the plants, and all those different connections, and the diversity of those connections is absolutely fundamental to the processes that underpin things like diversity restoration, net zero, the actual stabilization of carbon in soil. The microorganisms of the soil play a fundamental role in stabilizing that carbon and storing the carbon in the soil, but also in terms of food production and the focus on soil health. Now, I do think it's important to recognize that when we talk about soil and soil organic matter, it's not just the biological component, there's also the physical and chemical component, but the organisms and the diversity of those organisms plays a fundamental role in supporting these many functions on which above ground diversity that we're mainly interested in actually depend. So that's the third reason. I would say the third reason, is that these organisms are also under threat, considerable threat from a range of different global change drivers. There's been a wealth of studies in the last decade, and I think it's fair to say that there are many different global change factors now which lead to significant declines in the diversity or shifts in the composition of soil communities, with implications for the soil functions on which plant diversity depends and on which many processes like nutrient cycling and carbon storage depend. And just to give you a couple of examples, recent examples of the kind of changes that are occurring across the world, this is just one example. Probably the single most important factor, I would certainly argue, is land use change, the conversion of natural ecosystems to, say, croplands or plantations, but also intensive agricultural practices. And I think there's now an abundance of evidence suggesting that intensive agriculture, for example, simplifies soil food webs, so the actual complexity of that food web, and as a result, these communities have an impaired function, but also they can have an impaired resilience, for example, to climate change. And this is just one example. This is a study that was based on a synthesis of data collected looking at studies which have looked at how deforestation of natural forests leads to changes in the diversity and composition of communities below ground. So it's a global synthesis, and the main sort of headline message is perhaps unsurprising, but that land use change, particularly deforestation, leads consistently to declines in the diversity of fungi. It actually increases bacterial diversity, and it also leads to homogenization of those fungal communities, and also shifts from more beneficial through to more pathogenic organisms. So I think there's an abundance of evidence and ever increasing evidence. Every week when you put up new papers, for example, in journals, there's more and more evidence showing the significant declines in the diversity and composition of these communities, leading to functional changes within those systems. I just want to highlight one other change which is also occurring and which often goes unnoticed, which is climatic change, which exacerbates many of these shifts in communities below ground. And this is just one example. This is, again, a recent study which shows that intense climatic extremes, so heat waves, for example, and droughts, when they're intense and frequent, they can actually shift soil communities to what we might describe as an alternate state. So when you have high intensity climatic extremes, they can shift these systems to alternate states which are of impaired taxonomic diversity, but also impaired functioning with respect to carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycling. This is just one example, but it's really, hopefully, just to illustrate that there are many different global changes, some of them which we don't really think about, which are leading to big shifts in the composition of these communities below ground. Now, moving on to the actual theme of this particular discussion, which is about targets and also treaties and how effective they are for biodiversity, as we've just heard about, I think it is fair to say that certainly over the last 10, 15 years, soil protection has risen on the scientific and political agenda. But that, I would say, is predominantly related to physical and chemical properties of the soil, rather than explicitly integrating biodiversity within any of these biodiversity targets. So, for example, carbon storage is a key driver of many of these policy initiatives, erosion protection of the soil, rather than explicitly including biodiversity conservation and the benefits for functions as explicit targets within these different conservation and nature conservation protection targets. And I would also argue that if you exclude this soil biodiversity from these targets, the actual policies could fail to represent the majority of diversity on Earth and also the critical functions that these organisms actually perform. Now, many of these policies, for example, protection of habitats, may have spillover effects on these organisms anyway, but there could be hotspots of diversity, for example, that are missed by nature conservation protection that actually renders many of these communities vulnerable to future environmental change. So just to say a bit about where we are now, I'm a bit biased because I'm a soil ecologist myself, so I'm obviously a bit obsessed with soil organisms, but I would say that it is a challenging area, and there is probably good reasons why biodiversity in the soil has not been really included in many of these targets explicitly. And I think one of the biggest reasons is it's very difficult to study. It's very difficult to go out and get information on the diversity of all the different groups of organisms that actually occur in the soil. And that's actually reflected in the current position in terms of what we know about the global distribution of soil biodiversity or different groups of organisms worldwide. And this was a study which shows the global blind spots in diversity, but also the fact that where we have information on certain groups of organisms, it's rare that we know anything about the functions that they actually perform. So the current situation where we are in is that we have blind spots, geographical blind spots, in that we know virtually nothing about diversity in Africa, for example, and big parts of Asia. Tropical forests, for example, we have remarkably little information on the diversity of groups of organisms in those soils. But also, we have very little coupling between the diversity of those organisms and the functions that they actually perform. So I think this is a key area where monitoring of biodiversity, both spatially and temporally, is really essential to identify biodiversity hotspots globally, but also regionally or nationally, endemisms, so areas where there are unique communities, and also really to identify areas globally, but also nationally, which are priority areas for the protection of biodiversity within the soil. Now, just put that into perspective, there was a recent analysis that was published a couple of years ago that actually attempted to do that and identify diversity hotspots below ground around the world based on an extensive sampling. And they actually found that something like 10% of those areas were within existing protected areas. The majority of diversity hotspots in the soil globally, based on various criteria, are simply not protected at all. So it suggests that there's a real need, I would argue, to actually go out and sample these sites, have standardized monitoring programs in order to actually identify and target the places where there is a need to protect the diversity within the soil. Now, the last thing I'll just mention is that there's also, I would argue, a need for standardized measures. One of the problems that we face in soils is that people measure different things using different methods, etc. And it's an absolute nightmare trying to come up with any coordinated picture on what actually lives in the soil. But techniques are changing rapidly, and there are now new methods, sensing methods, molecular methods, and also there are programs actually coming up with standardized approaches to try and actually get a better picture, at least globally, on different metrics, standardized metrics of diversity across the globe, using a range of different parameters that link directly to different policy goals. And as I said before, traditionally, when people talk about soil health or fertility, they predominantly refer to the physical and chemical properties of the soil, whereas there's a real need, I would argue, to integrate these biological values. And I think we're in a position to be able to do that now, to actually get a much more holistic picture and to actually get biodiversity indicators that can be used for targeting different areas or priority areas for the conservation of soils. So just to wrap up, in terms of those sort of recommendations, I've sort of emphasised all these points, and I can talk about them obviously more in the debate. But I think really we're in a position now where we simply can't go ahead without including soil biodiversity within these treaties and targets. The knowledge is there about their diversity, about their functional importance, about the threats that they face in terms of global change. And I think we're now in a position where we have the methods to be able to actually include certain measures within these monitoring schemes. And we need those to have a baseline to be able to actually detect future environmental change. And also, I think, as I said before, there's a need to actually shift these indicators to actually encompass some of these biological measures. At the moment, they're physical, chemical, much easier to actually measure, still with challenges, but I think we're in a position where these biological measures could actually inform some of these biodiversity treaties and actually be used to set targets in the future to identify change. And then finally, I think an area that has actually been widely recognised and actually introduced into biodiversity treaties is the need for sustainable managed practice to actually protect and minimise soil biodiversity loss in the future. So a very biased view of the world in terms of what goes on underground, but I don't make any apologies for that because I actually think it's an important area of biodiversity for us to consider. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I mean, you say you're a fanatic about your soils, but I went to the Groundswell conference last year, and the farmers are so passionate about their soils, and specifically that group, I mean, are absolute obsessives, and the arrow has truly gone home, at least for that particular group, that how important sustainable futures are for soils and agriculture. So that's something we can think about. Okay, so thank you very much. Moving on, I'm going to introduce Mike here. Dr. Mike Barrett is the Chief Scientific Advisor of the World Wildlife Fund UK. So Mike began his career as a hydrologist working in water in sanitation, which is of course incredibly topical right here, right now, as the new government is grappling with today. And latterly was a civil servant working across DEFRA and Her Majesty's Treasury with a focus on biodiversity, international forestry and climate change policy. In government, Dr. Barrett was seconded to the Prime Minister's Commission for Africa in 2004 and 5 and was an EU delegation negotiator at the Nagoya COP in 2010 and managed the DEFRA ministerial offices from 2010 for 2013 before joining WWF. At WWF UK, Dr. Barrett is lead author on the biennial Living Planet report and leads on the delivery of the organisation's new strategy aimed at bending the curve to a future where nature's vital signs are improving. So thank you very much, and Mike, would you please take the stage?
Thank you very much, and yes, also hugely privileged to be here and to be invited, so thank you very much. I've actually only got one slide, and I wasn't going to put it up quite yet, but I think I better have, otherwise there's a big picture of me behind me, which is quite disconcerting. And with apologies, because EJ did say you might get bored of this. Well, I'm afraid this is up for the duration of my talk, so apologies for that. But I'll come back to this, but for the eagle-eyed amongst you, you might spot one difference from the version that EJ showed, but I'll talk about that later. So I guess this builds on some things that EJ's already mentioned, but COP15, I would say that the important thing wasn't 30 by 30. It was that mission that was agreed to halt and reverse the loss of nature by 2030. And I should say at this point, I'm probably going to say lots of things that would be regarded within the conservation sector and probably the conservation science sector as being quite heretical. But anyway, here goes. It really is worth just sort of pausing and reflecting on Georgina's role in achieving that 2030 mission. And my own personal sort of journey in WWF, I joined in 2013. I was going back to my first career as in science. I was given the task of creating a science team within WWF and a science strategy. and was quite intimidated about the prospect of doing that, and wasn't sure how I was going to do that, and then found on arrival that we had a board member and chair of our programme committee and advisor to me in my role, who was Georgina Mace. And the privilege of being able to arrive and have her to guide me through those years was just absolutely extraordinary. But then jumping ahead to 2016, which is when we first started to think about this idea of bending the curve. So this actually came about because we just launched a Living Planet report. We do these every 2 years. And I was sitting in a room with Georgina and a few other colleagues, and we were just expressing our sort of shared frustration that here's this report we put out every couple of years, talking about the state of the planet, the environmental state of the planet. And all we do is repeatedly sort of talk about this continuing decline. And yet, despite publishing all these reports, the decline continues. So clearly something wasn't working. And we reflected further that one of the problems we felt existed was that the global discourse on nature, on biodiversity, was wrong. The sort of level of ambition that existed was people talking about slowing rates of loss. And that was even reflected in some of the language in the predecessor to the Global Biodiversity Framework, the agreement that was negotiated in Nagoya. And this is where I have to put my hand up and accept my share of guilt, because as you heard in the introduction, I was one of the negotiators out there. And I understand from that experience now how easy it is as a negotiator, part of the political process, how easy it is to get sucked into the idea of achieving what you believe is politically possible at the expense of thinking about what is scientifically necessary. And we got that wrong in Nagoya. So we started to think about how we could change that discourse. And this was where we first started to talk about the idea of bending the curve of biodiversity loss. How do we move beyond slowing rates of loss? How do we actually stop loss? How do we actually start to restore nature on the planet? So that was where the idea first germinated. And that, of course, led to the first paper that Georgina published. And the critical thing in that was it didn't just set out this new ambitious idea of bending the curve of biodiversity loss, but it explained very clearly why it was necessary, and it also demonstrated that it could be measured. So all of a sudden we had this ambitious new idea that was pretty simple, challenging, but simple, and we demonstrated that it could be done and could be measured. Well, actually, I'll come to the could be done bit. So the follow-up to that paper was then this enormous modelling exercise, and I think in the end we ended up with something like 55 different global expert modelers around the world, all part of a process of trying to work through the different solutions and thinking particularly about trade-offs in a world where we're not just trying to hold and restore biodiversity loss, but also trying to feed a growing global human population with the land use pressures that entails as well. So having had this great idea of bending the curve, we needed to know if it was actually possible. And that was what the modelling exercise was about. And this diagram is, I suppose, the key sort of output from that modelling process. And the crucial thing with that green line is that was the conclusion. Under the most ambitious scenarios that we modelled, we demonstrated that you can bend that curve of biodiversity loss and continue to feed a growing global human population, which was obviously very critical. So then we were in a position of knowing that we had this great idea, we'd shown it could be measured, and we proved that it was possible. And that was what we had going into the negotiations, which culminated in the Montreal meeting. And I'd say a few months out from that meeting, we were pretty confident that we would be able to land this as an agreed political objective, what ended up as being the mission for the CBD to 2030. And then it very nearly came unstuck at the last moment. And this, I think, is also an interesting thing just to reflect on in terms of the roles of us as the scientific community. So it nearly unraveled because an article appeared in New Scientist, which essentially just started to describe the complexities of the challenge of being able to meet this target of bending the curve. And it demonstrated quite rightly that under many other scenarios, you wouldn't be able to bend the curve as early as 2030. It might take place a century later or even not at all. And the point was that was absolutely factually correct. Nothing wrong with the science, the case that was being made there. But what hadn't, I think, been appreciated was the way that an interesting sort of piece of scientific analysis then lumped into the culmination of a political process could really sort of skew the political process, because all of a sudden we were in a world where we had excuses essentially for politicians to be able to say, well, this all looks a bit tricky, so maybe we won't actually go down the road of trying to have this hugely ambitious target. And we had this direct feedback from negotiators who were on the ground in Montreal saying, look, we've got a problem here, because there's no longer, apparently, no longer a scientific consensus behind what is possible and what must be done. And here's where, I'm sorry to embarrass you, EJ, but I've got to acknowledge the role EJ played at this point, which was extraordinary. In the space of, I think, about 48 hours, working with David Abura, EJ had managed to pull together 4,500 global scientists who signed up to a letter saying, actually, this is necessary, it's possible, it's measurable, we can do this. And I think the lesson in that was that the letter that they signed up to was essentially backing a document which went back to Georgina's first principles of communicating a complex problem in a really simple and compelling way. And that had a huge impact. And the feedback, again, we got from negotiators on the ground was, okay, this has shifted the balance the right way again. And anyway, history is, we all know what happened. We have ended up with this as the globally agreed mission to 2030. And that, I think, is a fantastic thing. But, so this is where I get on to the little addition here. So you'll notice that I have, with no particular science involved here, I've scribbled on a label saying Montreal and pointing to that middle line. So the reason that I've done that is because in the modelling that we did to reach the green line, where we need to be, that factored in the most ambitious scenarios for conservation, which broadly is the sort of the 30 by 30 type territory. And then on top of that, looked at what could be done in a systems change sense, particularly in shifting the global food systems. Things like more equitable access to protein, restoring degraded lands for production, ending the trade in deforesting commodities. Huge range of things factored in. If you do all that, this is where you end up. So the problem we've got is that then when you look at the global biodiversity framework, this I think is where the politics has kicked in. Because the 30 by 30 bit is really quite easy to understand and play with as a negotiator. It's essentially, in crude terms, it's a kind of a cash for action deal. And that's where a lot of international negotiations do end up. And the Global Biodiversity Framework was able to negotiate that. So, the reason that 30 by 30 was agreed was because there were also commitments, primarily from wealthier countries, to put money into various global funds to pay for the costs of the protection that would be necessary to achieve that. Then you start to look at the elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework that talk about what is necessary in this part, the consumption and production piece. And I think it is reasonable to say that the targets there are vague at best. I think the only specific one is around food waste, and food waste alone is not going to close that gap. So if you look at things like how countries are expected to tackle their footprints, think about the UK and our offshore biodiversity loss through the things that we import. That is not captured in a meaningful sort of quantitative way in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So the risk from this is that when countries start to produce their national biodiversity action plans, which is how we're supposed to operationalise the Global Biodiversity Framework, you'll probably see quite a lot of strong elements in there around the 30 by 30 piece, which is broadly countries acting within the remit of their own countries to halt, restore biodiversity loss. The likelihood, I fear, I hope that the UK's MB-SAP will prove us wrong, but the likelihood, I fear, is that you'll see very little concrete action committed to on tackling footprint and offshore biodiversity loss and tackling the systemic drivers of change. And if that doesn't happen, this gap is going to remain. And crucially, I would see this as being a key role for the scientific community in holding the world to account, in explaining why that gap exists, measuring what the gap is, and pointing to the solutions that are going to be necessary to close that gap. And I did want to say just one thing about, I suppose, my personal experience of why that gap exists and the sorts of models or the sorts of current systems that are going to need to change if we're going to close that gap. So just over a year ago, I was on a visit with my Brazilian colleagues in the Amazon, and we went out to Santarém. So Santarém is it's on the Amazon River, quite sort of central in the Brazilian Amazon. It's pretty much as far up the Amazon as ocean-going cargo ships can go. And it's also a port at the northern end of a road that goes right down through the Amazon into the Cerrado, which is also a hugely important biodiverse landscape. And in both those areas, there is a huge amount of soy production. The soy Of course, you have access by means of this road. Deforestation takes place. The soy is produced. It's loaded onto trucks, taken up to Centrem, and then put onto the ships. Now, we actually spent a day bobbing around out in the river on a little boat, just watching what takes place. So Santarém is a port city. The port is enormous. I mean, it's a vast complex, built by Cargill, so a commodity trader, and they have funded this entire complex and in order to supply soy. But what you actually see happening, and this, I suppose, links back to the soil aspect as well, is so tankers come in, they come in full of fertilizer from Russia. The reason they've got fertilizer from Russia is because the soil in the Cerrado and much of the Amazon is actually not really suitable for intensive growing of crops like soy in the long run. The only reason you can make it work is if you really load it up with huge amounts of fertilizer. So you have these tankers that come half across the world, unload the fertilizer is taken down to the areas where the soy's been grown. Then soy is transported back up the road to Santarém, loaded back onto these huge ocean-going tankers. The tankers turn around, they head off back across the Atlantic to Europe, Rotterdam, some coming to the UK, many going to China. And why? Because they're supplying soy to feed pigs and chickens. So pause and just think about that as a kind of a model of agricultural production and trying to feed the human population. If you had a blank sheet of paper, I would challenge anyone to come up with that as a sensible solution. But that's where we're at. And the problem is that the global biodiversity framework at the moment is not going to tackle the drivers that are going to shift that. If we get into a world where parties are prepared to start tackling footprint, to include that in their MBSAPs, to have set real targets, then we start to close the gap. That's going to be absolutely crucial. And so that's where I would like to see the scientific community really focusing to hold the world to account to get to that green line. So look, just maybe a couple of closing thoughts. So given that this information all exists, why is it that we are where we're at? And I think that much of this has to point to some sort of communications issue. Are we as scientists doing enough to communicate clearly what is happening and what needs to happen if we're going to solve these sorts of problems? Do we sometimes fall into the trap of sort of overthinking things, or the trap of thinking that we've got to have 100% certainty? Maybe sometimes 80% certainty is enough if you're going to galvanize change in the short term, and 100% certainty can leave you a little bit too late to actually fix things. So we maybe need to think about that. Also, and here I just sort of draw back on my sort of old civil service experience and the experience of running ministerial offices. It's really easy for all of us to forget what it actually means to be a government minister and what your average day looks like. You are up at the crack of dawn, you're still going late at night, you'll have a rammed diary throughout the day, attending umpteen different events, probably spending a bit of time on votes in the Commons, trying to read in the evenings, after all that, your red box full of documents from various different advisors. If, as a scientist or as part of the NGO community, we spend lots of time trying to sort of negotiate amongst ourselves these sort of long wish lists of things that we'd love to happen, and then you send that into a minister's office, and then eventually that ends up in their red box and they're reading that later night. It's just not going to work. Having clarity, and real clarity on that ambition, what is possible, what needs to be done, showing it can be done, that's what we as the scientific community can do. And that, I believe, is why we were able to make a difference with bending the curve. And I think that's one of the things we should really take away from, certainly it's my experience of what I learned from working with Georgina. And I suppose last point on that, on the communication side, it's worth just one quote from David Attenborough, who essentially says, the biodiversity challenge now is a communications challenge. And I think to a large extent that is right. We've got to think long and hard about how we communicate what needs to be done. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. You're an enormously clear communicator, and I especially enjoyed the latter part of your discussion with this real insight into how government, the reality of government, and which leads me naturally on to Professor Gideon Henderson, who understands this at a very deep level. So Gideon became DEFRA's Chief Scientific Advisor from Oxford, October 2019, and he's a Professor of Earth Sciences at the Department of Earth Sciences in the University of Oxford. He's also a senior research fellow in Oxford and adjunct associate research scientist at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University. In 2013, Gideon was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society. His research uses geochemistry to understand surface Earth processes, particularly those relating to climate, the ocean, and the carbon cycle. So, Gideon, please.
So not included in my list of scientific interests is anything directly to do with biodiversity in that rather old bio that you just read out. So to some extent I feel like a bit of a pretender up in front of you, especially after the quality of speakers that we've already had. At least somewhat accidentally I am branded correctly, and I happen to have an Imperial notebook today with me. But another failing of mine is that I don't have any slides at all. And I'm really a bit fearful of having to talk in front of my ghastly picture for the whole of the time. So maybe we should go back to the bending the curve diagram again, so that we've just got a nice biodiversity image behind us. Thank you for relieving me of my own image. That's great. So it was a great honour to be invited back to speak at this event again. I've had the pleasure of coming before, and it's something I was very keen to accept. Partly because I've been visiting this site for many decades, I think even since earlier than Richard can claim to. But particularly to represent my respect for Georgina Mace and all that she contributed to this field in so many ways that I didn't interact with directly until really quite late in her career, and maybe I'll touch on that later on. Now, although this is a centre that's focused on the living planet, and that was absolutely what Georgina worked on, perhaps slightly perversely, I want to talk initially about climate. And I'm doing that because I want to tackle the question that was posed here about, are international treaties effective? Are they working in biodiversity? And then how can science feed into that? So let's use the major climate endeavour from an international point of view as an example of what works and what doesn't work. So that is the UNFCCC COP process that is driving change on climate processes. And if you think about what that programme is doing at a high level, it's got three goals. It first of all wants to mitigate our impact on climate change. It secondly wants us to get better at adaptation. And thirdly, it wants to sort out financial flows around climate change inequities. And if you think about those three targets, I would argue that the first one on mitigation, it's working. And I'll say a bit, well, you might not agree it's working fast enough, but it is broadly working. The second one, on adaptation, it isn't working, really. And the third one, on financial flows, is a heavily contested space. So let's just unpack that briefly on the climate side. So why does the mitigation side of the climate debate work? Slowly, perhaps, but at least it's working. So I think the 3 points here, and I'll return to these 3 points. The first is that it's got very well constrained and readily measurable targets. And it's been ruthless at trying to stick to those. It's all about CO2. There are other greenhouse gases we care about. We just convert them into CO2. It's not a perfect conversion, but it keeps things simple, it keeps them measurable, and it means that we can all focus internationally on that single target. The second thing that's really important is national reporting. It's not mandatory that you have to drive down your emissions, but it gets very embarrassing as a nation if you continually report that you're not driving down emissions. And the third thing that's really important in its success on mitigation is that politicians across the world and publics, critically, across the world understand why we need to do something about greenhouse gas emissions. They can see very directly in their own lives now, perhaps it's taken until recently for this to happen, but they can see why climate change is important to them and we need to do something to stop it. They can see why it impacts them and why it's going to impact their children and grandchildren. Now, where those three things are true, where you've got clearly measurable targets, where you've got national reporting, and where you've got an understanding of the need, you can see action. And there are lots of other examples on international treaties, things like the Montreal Treaty on CFCs, the London Protocol on dumping at sea, or the Stockholm Convention on persistent organic pollutants. All of those have those attributes about them, and all of them are being successful in achieving some sort of change. On adaptation in climate, those features are not true. And adaptation, at least in my view, and I think widely held view, is simply not working from a UNFCCC point of view. We're not driving the international change there. We haven't got the buy-in from national governments that we need in the same way that we have for mitigation. And on financing, that is a heavily contested space, and I'm not going to talk about it too long. But whenever you get into money flows, things slow down, things get difficult, because there are very different perceptions across the world about the values of the things that you're trying to put a financial value to. There's always contestedness about the mechanisms. And there's a vast call now on various international flows of money. The UK, for instance, has committed £12 billion to international climate finance, demonstrating the scale of that sort of financial flows that happen already in that market. So that's climate as an example of what works and what doesn't work. Now let's look at biodiversity, the subject really of today. And I would argue, and I think this is probably an argument that's come through from some of the other speakers as well, that up to now international treaties haven't really worked on biodiversity, and we just continue to see a degradation in biodiversity and continued biodiversity loss. I think now is a hopeful time because of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework that everyone's spoken about, and we've got something relevant to on the slide here, and also because of the BBNJ, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions Treaty protecting ocean areas. I think there's a real hope that we might see a reversal and more buy-in to those international treaties and more action according to them. But let's think about my 3 constraints for success and see how well posed even those most recent treaty arrangements are. So first of all, do we have targets that are very specific and measurable? Well, the GBF has 4 broad goals and 23 targets. And as some people have already mentioned here, if you pick into those targets, the language is not very tightly constrained and it's not sometimes very measurable. So I would say on that first criteria that to some extent, hopefully not too significantly, the GBF fails in having a simple single goal that people can really get behind. I realise that's a controversial view, and perhaps that will provoke some questions. It won't be the last controversial thing I say up here either. The second thing, do we have national reporting? Well, up to now we haven't, and that's been a failure, but we now have. And the last speaker spoke a little bit about that, about how we now have a requirement to report nationally on biodiversity, and I'm really hopeful that will start to make a positive difference on biodiversity. And the third thing, do we understand why it's important? I think this is the most important thing that I want to say. I don't think we do understand why it's important. I don't think the public understand why they should care about biodiversity. And we very quickly fall into a trap or a habit of saying biodiversity loss is bad, we need to do something about it, and then the rest of the arguments are all about how we do something about biodiversity loss. But why do we care about biodiversity loss? Now, scientists who work in this area understand that and think about it, but we have not managed to communicate this. It comes back to the point that we heard from Mike. It's about communication, but it's communication to the public about why they care personally, what's in it for them, why is it going to impact their life, why is it going to be an issue for their grandchildren and generations to come. And that, for me, is the biggest challenge that we need to face up to. We're not going to get politicians to actually act on this at the rapidity they need to unless their voting publics understand why they need to prioritise that above all the other things that need financial input. So we need to be, I think, more honest about our ability to explain why biodiversity matters. And something else I'd say here is we need to be careful, I think, about hiding behind the word nature when we make those arguments. Because everyone's got a very different understanding of what nature means. Even if you live in the middle of London versus the middle of a rural community in the UK, you understand nature differently. And if you go around the world to different communities, everyone's got a very different understanding of what that means to them. And they might think they have a very natural experience, but it's different from other people's experience. I'm afraid we have to get down and dirty and actually explain the science of biodiversity and be willing to explain why it matters and why it matters to people and their futures. It's not enough just to say, isn't it nice we've got a pristine forest somewhere because that makes me feel sort of ethically and morally good somehow. That might be true, it might give you a warm feeling, but it isn't going to cut it in the way that people will understand biodiversity. We've got to be willing to dig into the actual science behind biodiversity and explain it to publics and politicians so they understand why we need to act on it. So the other challenge that we were tasked as speakers with was not only to talk about treaties and how effective they are, and I've thought a little bit about that in what I've said already, but also to say something about how science should play into those treaties and international action on what we do with biodiversity. And here I want to talk about 4 different things, at least briefly, all related to science. The first thing is I think we need science to understand why biodiversity matters. And I think that it's the matters bit that matters. Okay, it's not just how does biodiversity work, it's the science that understands why we should care about it and what it is that we need to do to protect it as a consequence. So that's not my first area. We need to think about that, how the science should then feed into communications and really think about how we sell the results of that science to people. The second thing that we really need, and we still need more of, although we've got a lot of it already, is the science of measurement. And here I think we've seen quite a lot of improvement, really. Some of that improvement has come from Earth observation and our ability to now make very local, accurate measurements of something which is relevant to biodiversity. And that often is the type of measurement that we need. It's good that we have measurements at species level and we have experts and ecologists in the field doing those measurements, but that's too hard. It's too much hard work. It's not easy enough to measure. It's not easy enough to monitor. So we need to be developing the tools that will enable us to understand biodiversity change and the consequences of that to humans in the same way that Earth observation is enabling us to do. So I'm personally very excited about tools like environmental DNA that are going to change our ability to understand, coming back to Richard's talk, soil DNA, soil and biodiversity, but also many other environments as well. So what I'm urging for here is not just more measurements of biodiversity generally, but more focus on the way that we can simplify the measurements so we can make them more frequently and give them real understanding behind them. And it's not just biodiversity in the field where you care about it, it's also the flows of biodiversity and the trade issues. Been excited as an example of the sorts of power that you can bring to this field by the work we've been doing in DEFRA on grain verification, which isn't directly focused on biodiversity, but is focused very deliberately on understanding where traded goods have come from and the consequences of that trade, this time in the relevance to the Ukraine-Russia war. But this is also very relevant for forestry products and other traded goods. So that sort of measurement also really important if we're going to win this battle of biodiversity loss. My third area, and this is possibly controversial, is I believe quite passionately that we need to separate the science from the advocacy and the policy. And obviously I'm working in a policy setting, I work in government department, so I'm not saying we shouldn't shy away from mixing it with politicians, as you said at the beginning, Rod. We should be mixing it, but we should be very clear about where we're talking about scientific evidence and it's rational and analytical, and be clear where that stops and we move to a position where we're starting to advocate for something or arguing for a policy position. Because as we've heard already, ministers have a hell of a lot on their plate. They have a lot of difficult balances to make in that, in their day-to-day judgment. We need to free them up to make some of those judgments informed by the science and not cluttering that science up by telling them what they should decide based on that science. We have to let them deduce that themselves in the round. And the fourth thing, and perhaps this is going to be the most controversial thing that I'm going to say, is I really think we need to embrace, from a biodiversity point of view, the science of solutions. We shouldn't fall into the habit of thinking we need to conserve things in the way they were in the 1800s or any year that you choose to take. Nature and biodiversity has changed through the whole of Earth history. We need to continue to get from that biodiverse planet the things that we need. We know what we need going into the future, and we know the challenges that we face. We know increasingly some of the ways that we might harness biodiversity to solve some of those challenges, and we need to be willing to embrace them and think about those within our biodiversity thinking. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean here, one of which is gene editing of new crops, or GM of new crops, a way of harnessing the genetic diversity that we get from biodiversity and using that to build crops that enable us to get rid of pesticides or get rid of the extreme nutrient use that we have. So it's a way of using biodiversity to solve problems which, in a cyclical way, then help biodiversity themselves by lowering the impacts on biodiversity. Another example would be the extraction of genetics. I've talked about that in my last example, but there's doubtless tremendous benefit to be had still from extracting genetic information from our biodiverse world. Welcoming that, praising it and understanding what we can do, harnessing that is going to be really important for a communications point of view about biodiversity, as well as because of the solutions that that will provide. So in the GBF, one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is recognition of that genetic richness through the DSI process, the digital sequence information process, trying to share information and finances around that sequence information. And getting more controversial with my third and final example here, we know that climate change is causing significant damage to biodiversity. We also know that nature is significantly involved in consuming CO2. And there are lots of options at the moment being considered about how we can harness nature for additional carbon dioxide removal. And that's an area where I think we should be willing to embrace that, not thinking about how do we preserve something completely, but how might we use in a sustainable, ecologically sensitive way, a landscape or an oceanscape which will enable us to take more CO2 in and mitigate the effects on climate change, which in turn will lessen the burden of that climate change on biodiversity. I think part of those issues, part of recognising the solutions that biodiversity might give us, is also to recognise that people can make money from biodiversity. And that's sometimes a bit of a dirty word. People don't like to think of conservation being something that you can make money from. But I think we have to embrace that. And that's really where we're seeing change in the climate debate, is when private money starts to come in and say, we want to see a change in this system, and we can see how we can make money from it as well. Seeing it through an economic lens is going to be an important part of the solution to the biodiversity challenge. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Gideon. I mean, much of that is music to our ears. I mean, quantitating biodiversity and looking for ways to incentivize and monetize nature-based solutions is, you know, we live in a capitalist world. This has got to be how it looks. So, with so much to discuss here, it's my pleasure to introduce the chair of the debate, Guy Woodward. I want to call you the Vice Head of Department of Faculty of Biology. I got that wrong, didn't I?
Yeah, that's all right, don't worry, I'll cover for you.
Yeah, over to you.
Thanks very much, Matt. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. So I'm Deputy Head of Life Sciences. There are two deputy heads. I'm the one based here, the Country Mouse out at Silwood Park. There's another one in South Kensington. And after me, you'll hear a few words from our Head of Department, Dan Davis. Thanks very much, everyone, for a really fantastic and thought-provoking set of talks. There's plenty to debate now. We have about 25 minutes or so. We are a little bit behind schedule, but it's a beautiful evening, and I'm sure you don't mind us expanding a little bit into the night. So what I'll do is I'll ask the speakers to come up onto the stage. So you can sit here and I'll direct questions from the audience to you. Please don't be shy in asking your questions. It'd be very good to hear from early career researchers, junior members of staff, as well as more senior professors, etc. We want to keep the debate as open and as broad as possible. I'll just let everyone settle first. And I'll put my little timer on. If I can locate it. Give me 1 second. Right. Okay, folks. So I'll open it up to the floor in general. We have some student helpers, I think, with microphones. Yes, with the blue and the green microphone, the front and the back. They'll run to you. So please put your hand up and then wait until they come to you before asking your questions, so everyone can hear, because the acoustics in here are a little bit muffled unless you're using the microphones. Okay, so first question. Tilly, your hand went up straight away. You can kick things off. Hopefully something really controversial.
Thank you very much all. I'm Tilly Collins in the Centre for Environmental Policy at Imperial. And I'd like to pick up on the communication point and ask you all, who are great communicators for science, how on earth do we as scientists, and possibly as advocates as well, fight the might of commerce and advertising industries that are very empowered in a post-truth era to try and sell us things that we simply don't need, and who paint biodiversity as bad most of the time. Insects are annoying. So how do we fight these things? What are your communication top tips on getting the truth across? It matters.
Thank you, Tilly. I'll let someone put their hand up first if you would like to volunteer. Otherwise, I'll pick you entirely at random to start the responses off. Anyone want to go first? Maybe we'll start then with the last speaker, as you're the closest to me as well.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I see it in quite those sort of antagonistic, in quite such an antagonistic way. And it's a tough question, but I'm going to sort of call back on my climate example, where you can also see that sort of the global commerce industry saying, well, we shouldn't do anything about climate change, but publics and politicians and now legally most countries are signed up legally to the fact that they have to do something about climate change. So you can go around the power of the advertising system and the commerce system, if you make very powerful science-based arguments about why these things matter and why we should care about them. So I would, maybe we sometimes have to play the games of the advertising companies and be willing to use their shiny products in the way that we sell things. But I think it's the power of the argument and making it to the right people that's critical.
Thank you, Gideon. Does anyone want to add to that? EJ?
So I think that very last point is the key one. It's the segmentation. You have nobody speaks to the entire general public of the planet, so you can speak to specific audiences in specific ways. So I think speaking to policymakers, decision makers in one way that's very science-based, but then we as scientists don't have to do it all, so I think with the general public, we have a warmer audience than we realise, I think, in many cases. And that's something where, if you can talk directly and clearly and honestly about your science to school children, to whoever, in a way that's appropriate for that particular audience, I have faith that those messages can get through. But shouting into the void in the way that an advertiser does is never going to work, is it? I just think, yeah.
Mike, would you like to
Yeah, can I just add one thing? So, first of all, I think it's important also just to acknowledge, not all advertising and corporates are bad. There are good ones out there. But
WWF does some advertising sometimes, I believe.
Absolutely. But I think I think the answer probably comes back to a point that Gideon was making, which is people's perception of nature or biodiversity. And I say that because my big concern is that for those amongst us, and hopefully everybody here, I'm talking more widely, those amongst us who understand that climate change is a real thing, understand that, I think, in many cases, in the context of this is actually something which presents a financial or health or physical risk to me or others. When we talk about nature loss to people, those who believe in what we're saying, well, the reaction is generally, that's sad, isn't it? Well, unless we can move on from thinking it's sad to understanding this is our life support system, then I don't think we're going to get to where we need to be.
Yep. Yeah. Is that working? Yeah. The only thing I would sort of add to that as well is, again, a point that was made is about biodiversity being part of a solution, and I guess agriculture is a good example of that. Things like regenerative agriculture, and I guess that is filtering into advertising for food production, for example. There's probably a lot of rubbish attached to some of the claims about aspects of the environment and etc. and the benefits, but even so, it is actually presenting in a more positive way about certain aspects of biodiversity.
Thank you very much. There's one question here lined up first, and I'll come back to you others later. Frank?
Thank you. Communication came across very strongly in all the presentations, I think, and following on from Tilly's excellent question, should we not be using our national treasure, Sir David Attenborough, to make his next series called Biodiversity? He reaches out to the whole population.
I think we've got. I'll have a start on that. I mean, he is a national treasure. There are some other national treasures in the country, and the thing that jumped into my head when you said national treasure before you said his name is some of our wonderful biodiversity collections that we have in the country as well. And I think there is an important role for places like Kew Gardens, Natural History Museum, ZSL, to be doing more to sell the benefits of their collections to us. So harnessing the things that we have at national level and that we treasure is definitely useful. Whether Attenborough is the right person to do it or not, I'm not sure, but he certainly has a huge impact on public perception.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, I mean, there have been programmes on biodiversity extinction and things like that, for example, with David Attenborough, but I think shifting the emphasis to celebrating different aspects of biodiversity could be a positive way forward, really. You know, again, rather than just sort of presenting negative messages all the time, actually giving positive messages about celebrating the benefits that biodiversity has for different aspects of life, I think could be a more positive way forward.
Yeah. EJ?
I also think we need to be careful about assuming that everybody thinks like us. Particularly, and, you know, if you really want to reach out to different parts of society, you need to have people who are part of that part of the society. You know, so I'm thinking, for example, that we're still a terribly undiverse group of people who work in this field, and where are the opportunities for people who have been brought up in urban settings? Where are the opportunities for people who are marginalised, people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds, different backgrounds? Where are their chances to say what they think about nature and biodiversity? I think that's what I think we should be asking ourselves.
Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
Actually, EJ's broadly said, but I was going to say, yeah, I think we've, obviously David Attenborough, is WWF ambassador. We work with him on television series, things like Our Planet, for example, an amazing person. But yes, he doesn't necessarily, we can't assume that he reaches everybody. I was talking to EJ about this the other day. It's and one of the joys of having kids is being challenged on your own perception of things. I had the extraordinary experience of my daughter explaining to me how establishment Greta Thunberg was the other day. So we've got to bear in mind, you know, it's different groups and different people. We all think that certain people reach, they don't reach everybody. So there's got to be this much more diverse group of champions of biodiversity, I think.
Yeah, I think that point about the echo chamber is very well made, and there is a bit of a risk here, and sometimes with some of these more technical terms, even biodiversity. I mean, probably for most of the general public, if they think about biodiversity, it probably means pandas and the number of species. But if you ask two ecologists to define biodiversity, you'd probably get 12 different definitions. So we need to be a bit careful of that echo chamber thing, but also that navel gazing that can also come with it. Okay, thank you very much, folks. Another question. Sorry, you with the multicoloured lanyard and the peach top. Yes, you were the next one in line. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, again, just following on from, I guess, the last two questions, really good points about how the communications is really what we're falling short on here. We do need more diverse voices. We do need people from different places and from different perspectives, but you are the people on the stage right now. So if you had 20 seconds to tell some person on the street going shopping why they should be caring about biodiversity, what would you say in those 20 seconds just to the person on the street?
Right, okay, you've got 20 seconds each. We start at this end and we move through. Gideon, would you like to go first?
Well, I haven't prepared my 20-second speech for my supermarket interaction, but for me, the two things the areas of science that I would try and explain, I'd have to get the language right for the audience, but the two things for me that are the biggest benefit that we get from biodiversity are the resilience that it gives us so that our systems are more able to deal with change, and that the genetic richness that is there, which we just haven't begun to tap into yet. And we've already got some really great examples of products, food products, but also medical products that have come from that biodiversity. So I'd try and, that's all rather too technical. I'd try and pitch that in a more Tesco's way. You know.
Mike?
Right. So I think I would make the point that nature is our life support system. Think about somewhere like the Amazon rainforest. We lose that. We don't just lose 10% of the world's biodiversity. it means that we lose any prospect of avoiding global dangerous climate change. And I'll follow that up by explaining that the actions of all of us here have a direct consequence and impact on what's happening over there through the choices we make, whether that's our financial investments or the things that we buy. We're all responsible. It's not their sad problem over there.
Richard?
I always ask a similar question in PhD vivas at the end, and they always ramble on for about 10 minutes. But I would say, yeah, if I was in a supermarket, I'd probably say, yeah, without biodiversity, we simply wouldn't have all this range of foods.
Good. EJ?
All of that, plus, as we get into climate change and we have more flooding and more heat, let's just think about what the trees give to us. And so, for example, in an urban setting, trees give you shade, they cool you. You have your wetlands in the urban setting that actually clean the water. You have your pollinators that make the food that you rely upon. So not only does biodiversity help to make things that you eat that you need, but it also protects you against the ravages of climate change. And without it, climate change is worse.
Great, thank you very much. The next one would be, Jess, you can come in a second, but the lady there in the blue. Thank you.
Hard question.
Hi, Jacqueline Edge from South Kensington campus. I wonder if one of our biggest interfaces with nature as Brits is our gardens. And you can actually watch transformation of biodiversity if you start to introduce sort of no-dig policies and trying to encourage more pollinators. And maybe that's the way we could reach a lot of people, because our gardens actually take up quite a large amount of space. And there isn't enough in gardening programs about wildlife gardening. And my husband and I have been trying to figure it out, and we're just finding very little about it. And that'd be really nice to see more programs like that.
Thank you. A few thoughts. I did notice, actually, just recently, one Sadiq Khan is exploring the idea of penalising people for concreting over their gardens, for example. So there are some local actions there which might have larger scale implications. Folks, would you like to chip in? Who would like to go first? Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more, really. And in response to the previous questions as well, I mean, to me, as someone who teaches as well, I think the key thing is connection with actual biodiversity, getting school kids out. I mean, soil is an incredibly dull topic, for example, but when you do things with school kids, for example, if they have an earthworm to play with, they don't care about sophisticated bits of equipment and data. They like earthworms, or they're like beetles, you know. And I think getting people in connection in urban areas and gardens, community gardens, are obviously a key way of doing that.
Sorry, EJ.
No, go on.
Oh, Gideon, of course.
Well, we need to be careful again that, of course, quite a lot of people don't have gardens.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
your point in the round about how do people access natural spaces, or whether they come across nature, is important. I do have a sense that there is more communication in this area. Chelsea Flower Show, of course, is even more rarefied than the typical garden by some orders of magnitude. But there was quite a lot of activity around biodiversity at Chelsea this year, and we're seeing more of a push in that direction. I think the one about the importance of bees as pollinators, I think, won an award as an example. So that is bringing those arguments into some public discourses. But that is a very rarefied discourse, that one in particular. But what we're starting to see, and we should see more of, is in local parks, not just community gardens that might be organised by a local community, but the parks that universities own or that cities run, or the hedgerows that are on the edges of farmers' fields. All of those have the prospect to teach people more about the benefits of biodiversity, and that's where we need to try and get people into interface with it, not just in their backyard.
Yeah, I think I get the question a lot from my neighbours, for example. I really despair about biodiversity loss, but I don't know what I can do. I feel so powerless. And I think a lot of what we have to push against is that feeling of powerlessness that a lot of the general public have. They understand to some extent, so when I get people saying that to me, I try to say, you can make the little changes in your life that are not necessarily going to turn you into, the good life. Just showing my age. You can eat less meat, you can use less pesticides, you can have bee-friendly areas and so on. But there's other things that you can do. So there's that, but you can also, there's the sphere of influence. So you can go to your workplace and say, what's our sustainability strategy? Can we have one? There's that, if you really want to get deep, you can get into your pension fund or whatever it is. And then the final scale of influence is the societal one, where are you voting according to nature? Are you actually examining the policies that your governments have? Are you making an informed choice when you have an MP? Are you telling your MP that you're making that informed choice? Are you telling your pension fund that you're making that informed choice? So start small, start doable, start with your own life, little hacks that you can make. Don't feel you can fix it all. We're all hypocrites. You know, I've got an iPhone, that's a bad thing. But hey, you know, I can't give that up just yet. But I can eat less meat, you know, and then kind of work out in concentric circles through your communities to your wider influence. I don't know if it helps. My neighbours are still despairing.
I think there's a danger, though, in that sort of approach that a hell of a lot of people are not even asking those questions. Most people in the country are not asking their neighbours, how do I do more for biodiversity or nature? It's just not on people's radars at all. That's the majority of the public, and that's where the communication challenge is at its greatest, I think.
Can I jump back in there with an example? So I'm a horse rider. I was delighted to read in my edition of British Horse an article about environmental sustainability. I thought, yes, we're getting there. And so I thought, I read it, and it was, well, we should have less single-use plastic in our shows, and maybe when we're plaiting our horses, you know, we shouldn't be using rubber bands. And I thought, oh my God, is that as far as you can get? So I wrote a letter to British Horse, pointing out Dave Goulson's recent work on spot-on insecticides from pets that goes into the watercourses, and you know, I think it's like pretty much every river that he sampled was, you know, 3 times the level that would kill a caddisfly or something, and said, as a horse rider at this time of year, I dump a load of insecticide on my horse when we go out because we don't want horse flies. I then come back and I wash my horse, and it all goes into the watercourses, and maybe that is something that is our biggest thing that we should be looking at in our environmental sustainability, or at least we could start looking at that. Let's use citronella, albeit it doesn't stop the horse flies, it smells nicer. I wrote it seriously, obviously. It was not published. And then I've got the summer issue of British Horse on my coffee table, which is full of adverts for insecticide fly sprays. So I did write to them saying, I'm sure this isn't true, but it's not a good look. Anyway, so this is kind of following up from Gideon. I really think that a lot of sectors, a lot of people in their hobbies don't get what the main thing they should do is. And I bet with horses, spot-on insecticide is a disaster.
They don't get it, but they also don't get why they should do it. Sorry to...
Well, yeah, so I think actually that's right. So I was going to come back to it was really interesting the way that you framed the question there. I'm just triggered a great debate. But the framing of the question was very much in the context of, you know, for most of us, our main impact on nature or contact through nature is through our gardens. Notwithstanding the fact that obviously not everybody does have a garden. But I think what you're hearing from EJ is the point that actually what we need to explain is actually for many of us, particularly in wealthier countries, our impact on nature is primarily not through our gardens. It's through a much wider range of choices that we're making.
Gideon, did you want
I did jumping in.
Sorry, Vincent, there's one. I'll do you second. Lady there in the grey? Yeah, I think you've been waiting for a little while. Sorry, Jess, I'll come back to you after Vincent as well.
Hi, I'm Cordelia Roberts. I'm a postdoc here at Silwood. I want to pick up on something that Gideon said about advocacy and being a scientist and maybe where that line is drawn. And I'd love to hear about what that practically looks like when, if I consider my own career and perhaps a lot of others, has potentially been stimulated by being an advocate for the environment, being interested and engaged in it. And the fact that actually some of the greatest biodiversity losses come from need or can be prevented by having advocacy. For example, wars in countries like in Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, that kind of destruction of environments is also something that we have to consider about. And so I don't agree with the fact that advocacy and being a scientist should stop at that. We are humans, and the way that we interact with others and the way that we can potentially be swayed by things, yes, is by evidence, but also by what people's emotions are and how they feel about that. And I guess, what on a practical level does not being an advocate or introducing into policy, how does that look like?
Mike, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks. It's interesting. So, and of course, you heard from my bio at the start. I've had my sort of government policy experience and now my NGO sort of science and advocacy experience. And curiously, the first job title I had in WWF was Director of Science and Policy, so that's straight together. So I think Gideon's right to a point, and as I described in my talk earlier, you have to understand the limitations of the headspace that a minister has got. But that doesn't mean you have to have a complete separation between policy and advocacy. And so the specific example I would give is when Michael Gove first became Secretary of State for DEFRA. I confess at the time I never thought I'd be sitting here saying this, but when he first became Secretary of State for DEFRA, he decided to give his first public speech on the environment in the WWF offices. So he came down there to do that. And so the deal was we said, well, we'll let you use our offices as a backdrop, but we want you alone in a room for half an hour beforehand so we can have a conversation. And we did. And the conversation that we had with him was in just really quick and simple terms explaining the concept of the UK's international environmental footprint and the fact that we offshore biodiversity loss to other places. We could have just left it at that and said, here's the evidence, here's the size of the UK's footprint, this is where it is. We didn't. We went one step further. We said, therefore, there has to be a policy response from UK government to address this if you've going to have any credibility on tackling the global biodiversity crisis. We didn't go as far as saying, prescriptively, and now here are the steps you should take, because Gideon's right, you've got to give the ministers space to do that. But it worked, going to that point worked, because the direct consequence of that, and I think it is reasonable to say it's a direct consequence, was that Michael Gove, one of the first things he did, he went away and created this thing called the Global Resource Initiative, which was this amazing think tank to come up with responses on what should be done. One thing I would flag at the end, and this is a little bit of a spoiler in all this, that should have culminated eventually following the Environment Act, which calls for an obligation to act on the UK's footprint. There should have been secondary legislation tabled to implement that. The last government never did that. Just the policy point here, open goal for the new government to act. They don't even need primary legislation. All they've got to do is table the secondary regs. The UK starts to tackle its footprint. But that's an example, I think, of where you can use science to build into the policy space, still give politicians space to come up with the ideas.
Can I come back on the question?
Thank you very much. Yes, Bill. I'll just take two more questions after as well, just to bear in mind managing the time, etc. So, Gideon, yes, please.
Well, there's nothing wrong with advocacy. I wasn't saying that. And if you care passionately about something, you want to advocate for it, then please don't take my remarks to mean that. What I was arguing for, and I do really strongly believe, is it's very important to separate the scientific, the rational, from your advocacy position if you want to do both of them. And it's fine from a scientific point of view to say, if you follow course A, this will be the outcome. If you follow course B, this will be the outcome. You can present all that in a rational way without having to say, obviously, course A is better. Okay? And that's the sort of argument you can make scientifically. And often if you do that dispassionately and logically, it's bloody obvious that course A is the better course. And ministers will take that on board, or policymakers will take that on board. If you start to build the advocacy into the whole thing, so you're building your whole argument around saying, obviously, course A is better, then your scientific evidence looks like it's biased. And often it is, frankly. Most of the really contested spaces that I have to deal with in government are because different sides of the argument are advocating for something, saying we're following the science, and they're using a different set of science for those two different arguments. They're both following science, but they're not trying to be dispassionate about the way they deal with the science. So if you're going to advocate, really try and separate it from the scientific arguments and make sure that you're as rational as possible with those.
Thanks very much. Richard Nija, I'll leave you out of this one for now because I'm just conscious of time a little bit. We can always come back to it if there's further points to make at the end to wrap up. But I'll do Jess next, and then Vincent, you can ask the final question, if that's okay. Jess?
There's also two questions at the back.
Well, sorry. Okay, we might squeeze in a couple at the back. Sorry, if I didn't see you at the back there. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you very much all for your talks. As just mentioned, we've got a new government. We've heard the King's speech. They've got a lot to do. How do we ensure that nature continues to be a focus over the next 4 or 5 years? How do we ensure that that is really pushed for? And when I say we, I'm going to ask you to maybe focus on early career researchers, because we can't get people like Michael Gove in the room just yet. So what can we do to ensure it's a focus? Thank you.
What I'll do, maybe just in the interest of time as well, just to ask one response. If someone wants to leap forward, then we'll move on to the next question.
I would say one thing. I think, certainly as an ecologist, I think the nature of ecology has changed dramatically. I mean, when I started, it was predominantly fundamental science, and fundamental science still has a very important role, but increasingly the nature of ecology is shifting towards solution-based ecology, actually using the science to come up with solutions to address environmental challenges. And I think there are a lot of, I'm not saying that early career scientists should all do that, but I think there are opportunities, increasing opportunities for the work that you're doing as an ecologist in biodiversity to actually present that work, or at least frame it in the way that it could be helping to address certain environmental challenges. And when you get opportunities to give talks to different audiences, you can still present those kind of ideas, obviously with caution and things like that.
If I'm forced to be very quick, can I jump
Go on,
in?
be quick.
So,
yes, very quick.
So it builds on Richard's point. We've heard this new government talk a lot about growth. Growth is their primary concern. And if you can connect the ecosystems or the biodiversity to a possibility of driving growth, a new product, a new way of dealing with the environment, that is a very strong argument to be making at the moment.
Yeah, the gentleman in the blue jumper with the white shirt there. Oh, so the guy next to you there. Sorry, I had him lined up. You can go next after him.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
There's no microphone there.
Yeah, you can just pass it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Simi Bezeng from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. Thank you to all the great speakers. I quite like some of Gideon's controversial recommendations. It's indeed true that we have been communicating to the same audience, the scientists, the conservationists, and our messaging has been very negative towards biodiversity laws, which is okay because this is what we care about. We have not been particularly good at showing what it takes to move a species like the Saiga antelope from a higher red list category to a lower red list category. And of course, to celebrate that conservation success that we've achieved, are there any strategies towards positive messaging to show that conservation takes time? I mean, I don't know how long it took the Saiga antelope to get to that level. It takes time. It requires incredible amount of resources to be able to do that. Are there any thoughts on that? Thank you.
Thanks. Can we just take one answer for this so we can make sure we keep to time? EJ, I wonder if you might comment on this one, given your expertise with the massive turnaround for the Saiga.
25 years and a massive effort by governments, NGOs and scientists all working together.
No easy shortcuts, I guess. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And then maybe we can ask the question there, the gentleman with the microphone. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Mahamadi Kentega. I'm postdoc working on malaria vector in Burkina Faso. So I have a question. It's about the insecticide, because we are using insecticide for vector control, and this is the main solution that we are using. And also, insecticide is also widely used in agriculture. And my question is that how we play with because the use of insecticide and also fertilizer, this is a threat for biodiversity because of the non-target species that are lost. My question is how we play with it, because this is also this has also a benefit, because we don't have another solution like vector control. We don't have another solution. The solution is insecticide, and also in crops agriculture using insecticide. How we play with the benefit and also the threat.
Okay, thank you. EJ, you get a free pass on this. You've already done your horse pesticides. Maybe Richard, perhaps you'd like to mention.
Yeah, well, it's a very difficult issue because, as you say, there are big trade-offs, and I guess it relates to, intensive agriculture is relies heavily on agrochemicals, for example. But I mean, to me, one of the key things is trying to understand when those agrochemicals are being used inappropriately. So, for example, if they're being used at the wrong time. I mean, I don't know so much about insecticides, but certainly with fertilizers, I think one of the biggest problems is there's not a problem with fertilizers per se. The problem is that there's too much fertilizer put on the land, and it's put on the land at the wrong time. And I wonder with insecticides whether, as well, using them in a more targeted way could be potentially, I don't know about the situation you're talking about, but that could be a solution to that, but also looking for biological solutions as well at the same time.
Thank you. Final question. Vincent, our director of the Georgina Mace Centre. I'm sure we'll have a real zinger for you. So hopefully each one of you get one more response, and then I think you've done an excellent job, and we can go and have refreshments, etc. So Vincent, please.
Yeah, so it seems to me that people have started to take climate change very seriously when they got in trouble. More flooding, more heat wave, more wildfire. So I think most people would wouldn't say any issue from biodiversity loss so far. So shouldn't the communication be more showing actually issues that are starting to cause trouble, maybe zoonotic diseases and so on, rather than just carry on with biodiversity is good for A, B, and C, but careful, the trouble have started.
I very much agree. I think that is the challenge we face up to, and the previous question was a case in point where if you live somewhere where there's vector-borne disease, you want to protect yourself and your kids and your grandchildren from that vector-borne disease, and that far outweighs any understanding of why that's bad for biodiversity or why you should do anything about it. So of course you're going to carry on spraying your insecticides to protect your health. We've got to be able to make the communication, solve the communication challenge of why does it matter? What is the loss of insects going to do to your environment, to your human condition on the planet? And actually in insects, the case is quite strong because they're so important as pollinators. That's an example where there's a direct service that we get from biodiversity. You can see why there's damage to the system. You can motivate people to try and alter their practices. But we need those sorts of concrete examples of why it is that your activity is harming something which will come back and bite you later. Otherwise it won't land. Yep. I think we're making those arguments strongly enough at the moment.
Mike, would you like to respond?
Yeah, so two things. So it's not the case that no one is feeling the impact of nature loss. One example is we work with cattle ranchers in Peru and Brazil, and many of them have been involved in active deforestation in the region. They are now actively involved in tree planting because what they've discovered is when you deforest any kind of scale, you end up with longer, drier, hotter periods, and you can't actually raise your cattle anymore because it's too hot for them. Then having to plant trees to shade the cattle. So there's a little bit of an example of people at a local scale realising that what you do to nature does come back to bite you. But the bigger point, I think, is that, again, thinking about the Amazon crisis and risks of tipping points there, if you talk to many people in the climate science community, they will talk about a potential tipping point in the Amazon as a result of global climate change that might happen at some point in the late part of this century. Therefore, don't worry about it quite yet. If you talk to people in the biodiversity space, thinking about the science panel for the Amazon, for example, who operate in the region, they are looking at it not through the global climate change lens, but through what happens when you deforest at a local level and how that ends up changing the local and regional climate and generating a tipping point, which is potentially going to happen in a matter of a few years, not in the last part of this century. The problem is these two conversations are going in complete isolation. And that is not entirely surprising when you consider that at UN level, we deal with climate change over here in the UNFCCC, and we deal with biodiversity loss over here in the CBD. That's mad, actually. That really is. The good news there is that I think for the first time, you're seeing President Petro in Colombia, who they will be hosting the CBD meeting later this year in Cali. You've got President Lula in Brazil, who will be hosting the climate COP next year in Belém, Brazil. And those who are politically close and are talking together, and there are plans to start to draw these together. I think that's absolutely necessary.
Thank you. Richard, would you like to add a few words?
Yeah, I agree entirely, and I think until people actually see the impacts on their health or on the society around them, they're not going to actually react. But I think there are places in the world where that is starting to happen, and I think a good example, again, if I go back to soil, but soil degradation is happening in many parts of the world on a massive scale, and it's starting to impact people. I mean, it's not entirely related to diversity loss, but there are they are interlinked, and people are starting to react as they see the consequences for their families, for their livelihoods, etc. I mean, it's not easy, but it still is starting to have impacts. But yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. And EJ, you get the final word.
Wow. I mean, the thing I'm thinking really is just to make the point that biodiversity loss and nature recovery, because I'd like to see both sides represented, the positive as well, should be a broad church, not political and not in a particular part of the politics that we're in. And I worry that we need to make sure that we don't have biodiversity seen as a left-wing cause, basically, putting it bluntly. It needs to be something that the Telegraph reader gets behind, as well as the Guardian reader, as well as the, whoever. And it needs to be something that everyone in our society understands why it's important in their own context. So I also think that, pushing back a little bit on Gideon, that for some people the quantifiable, this is the issue that's happening, is the way forward. But for others, the spiritual nature thing is really important, and that's what matters more than anything. And we shouldn't lose sight of that. Just think about Sycamore Gap, how much that hurt lots of people. So I think let's keep the patchwork, the mosaic, the broad church, and yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Very well put. Well, I'd like to thank all of our wonderful panel for a fantastic evening and being such great sports and going through the grilling they've just been through. You've handled it with great aplomb. So thank you very much. We'll let you leave the stage now. Also, thank you very much to the audience for your fantastic questions and your patience. And I'll hand over while you guys vacate the stage to Professor Dan Davis, our head of department here at Life Sciences. Thank you.
We've got to get that photo. Why don't we go back to this famous slide of changing the curve or whatever? Right, it's a privilege to be here. One of the weird things about being the head of life sciences is just that you sort of get thrown into areas that you don't know much about really, but are profoundly important, really fascinating, wonderfully exciting. As Guy said, I'd like to thank all the speakers, EJ, Richard, Mike, Gideon, plus the organisers, Vincent, Matt, the chairs, the co-chairs, Guy, Emily Govan did a lot of work behind the scenes, who's standing at the back there, and Pat Evans as well. It was wonderful to see all this great scientific work, papers published in Nature, PNAS. One of the things I'm taking away, though, is that some people are letting the side down one of us, EJ, can't even publish in The British Horse. I found myself Googling the magazine of The British Horse, and I'm thinking that's a rabbit hole I didn't need to go down. This is the third Georgina Mace Centre debate. The centre's going from strength to strength under UT. That's fantastic. The beautiful campus as well, Silwood Park. It's just recently celebrated its 75th anniversary. Guy Woodward has 5 more days to go as the head of Silwood Park, and it's been really a fantastic achievement he's done to bring Silwood Park into such an exciting place where it is now. And we aim to transition smoothly to Tom Bell, who's also here. He's going to head up Silwood Park in a couple of weeks, and we're going to make this campus an even more exciting place to be, so that it's not just life sciences that's here, but that we also bring on board engineering, maths, other kinds of disciplines onto this campus, which I think we all agree is really important. A couple of formal things, and I'm going to say one other thing. It's the debate is going to be shared online, so you could re-watch it or share it with your friends. There's also the Georgina Mace annual report that you could download, the letter to the government's all online. Follow them all on social media as well. But there is something else that strikes me listening to this whole thing. My own research area is in understanding the immune system, and at face value, understanding the immune system has nothing to do with understanding biodiversity. And yet, listening to all of you speak, actually, there's something really profound and meaningful that is identical with understanding the immune system. I mean, at one level, we're dealing with a lot of complexity. That goes without saying. But what has come across here is that the impact of what you do is all about the communication of what you do. Now, we saw because of the pandemic, how the immune system became, a big deal with the public. And, when the vaccines that came out that we all saw, save, it's been estimated they save about 20 million lives. And actually, whether people, use the vaccines or how they approach biodiversity, climate change, all these sorts of really big issues really rely on trust in science in a really kind of deep way. And it did strike me that some of the things that we've been talking about in the immune system field are very similar to what you guys were talking about. And actually there's some differences in the way in which that's approached. All of us understand that science is precise, right? That's how you get your iPhone or we have electric cars. Science is precise. But we also know as scientists that science actually isn't quite always precise, right? There's a kind of open-ended nature to science, and that becomes confusing to the public. We can't say with absolute certainty, right, that the vaccine is safe. We can't say that the vaccine is safe, say, in this combination or that combination, right? There's the weight of evidence, which is important to how we project the science into policy. And you mentioned that, is it enough to say that something's 80% certain, right? But once you open up once we acknowledge that things aren't necessarily absolutely true, that it's not always entirely precise, that then means that people are going to be persuaded, and they can be persuaded by good oratory skill. They could be persuaded by a TikTok, right? They could be persuaded by anything. And that makes it all about the way in which we're communicating the science. And for me personally, it's about people understanding how science works. That's the crucial thing. That's what we have to be communicating. It's not about the biodiversity or the immune system or the vaccines, not any of the particular issues. It's about getting across how science comes to these kind of policies and statements. So that's where everything relies on non-scientists, whether it's the public or whether it's governments or whatever it is. It's about understanding the process for science. So that means, having said that means that this debate couldn't be more important, because this is how science works in its best way. That there were differences of opinion of some of the things that you said, and you were projecting that to all of the people in this room, which leads me to say one more thing, which is that next time, what really matters is getting a bigger tent and more people in it. Thanks for listening. Thanks for coming. There's drinks over there.